back in studio with immediate past former co-host of The Uprising, Tim Donner.
Immediate past and former, that's being redundant. If you're immediate past, you are inherently
It's Friday.
former. Yeah.
I'm in a good mood. I don't want to spoil it with that kind of discipline to my speech, Tim. I want to thank you for doing a good job on The Uprising last week, and also announce to everyone that I've already discussed with you the issue about your aesthetic judgment of Whoopi Goldberg's dramatic career, and that those types of comments won't be made on The Uprising in the future.
It's as, folks, just for all of you listening, this is what's called viewpoint discrimination. Scott engages in it on a regular basis, and it's there for all. It's out there naked for everyone to see.
Well, speaking of viewpoint discrimination, something a little more controversial than Whoopi's acting is abortion in the United States. And we've really had, I wouldn't have thought that, when Donald Trump was elected, that the next 2 years would see this massive change in or effort to change abortion law in the country. I think that my sense of Trump and his sort of pro-lifism was he didn't really care about it one way or another, but recognized it was important to a lot of people who would be his base. And so he said he'll throw his lot in with those. So, but be that as it may, we have these heartbeat bills that are going on around the country. We've got the Alabama bill, which is not a heartbeat bill. It's just basically an abortion ban.
Yes.
With very minor exception for the life of the mother or significant health of the mother. And I thought that, so much of the conversation out there is the people on the pro-choice side screaming at the people on the pro-life side and vice versa. And I think that it's fair to call you a fairly staunchly pro-life person.
Yes.
And I'm fairly staunchly pro-choice person. And I think we can have a civilized conversation about it, and that might be interesting. So that's why I wanted to talk to you about it today.
Well, and I think the reason that we can, Scott, is because we have respect for each other's positions. And when you have that kind of respect, you have the kind of rare conversation that we can have here, because I respect why you are pro-choice, and I think you respect why I am pro-life. And let me just say this, Donald Trump, for all his misgivings, his multiple marriages, and the statements that nobody can understand who's not a Christian why he has 85% support among evangelical Christians, given the pattern of behaviors in the past and everything, I think that Donald Trump was basically pro-choice by default because of the political climate in New York where he built his empire. Mm-hmm. You simply couldn't be pro-life in a city that's 90% Democratic.
So, let me just get this straight. Do you think that was in the zeitgeist, in the air, so he just was that thing? Or do you think he concealed his true pro-life nature?
I think you said it best at the beginning. I think he didn't particularly care about the issue. So I think when they said, "Are you pro-choice?" he's like, "Yeah, I'm pro-choice." Mm-hmm. And he even said in the past that he was very pro-choice. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to cozy up to the Schumers and the De Blasios and the David Dinkins and all the people he's had to suffer over the years.
Can you imagine?
So look, I'm not going to say whether, he feels it in his gut the way most pro-lifers do. But I will say this. He is easily the most pro-life president we've ever had. He gave the strongest pro-life declaration when he accepted the nomination in his nomination speech. He has listened to and sympathized and empathized with the pro-life position in almost every instance, even beyond the point that he had to just sort of nominally to mollify his base. So, I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that he would be the most pro-life president of all time. But here's two reasons, one constitutional and one faith-based, for those of us that are pro-life.
Well, before we get into that, let me just say, with the exception of picking Supreme Court justices, the president has very little to do with the abortion question in America.
It's more...
In 1973, we had Roe v. Wade. Its legacy bred Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and sort of the legacy of the different restrictions that are permissible. The Supreme Court has created this kind of tangled web of patchwork surrounding abortion law. There's kind of really ridiculous sort of precedent in terms of you can actually restrict speech around an abortion clinic in ways that you can't do anywhere else in America.
Right.
So there's this interesting patchwork, and it seems like I think the backers of the Alabama legislation believe that the votes are now there on the Supreme Court. And if we count, we've got most recently Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, and then the stalwarts. You've got Thomas. He's a vote almost definitely to overturn Roe. And then where does Roberts come in, and where do Alito come in? Well, those get you to 5 if they'll do it.
It's a gambit. I mean, that's what it is. It's a gambit. They're going for the long bomb. They're going for the fly pattern, not the 10-yard pass over the middle. And so they believe that the climate is right. I agree with you and most observers that I've seen that I don't think it is quite right.
Yeah,
I don't think it will be until...
I think we've talked about it on the radio, but I don't know that we've talked about it in the upper. So my prediction is at least one of those people, of those 5 we mentioned, will not vote to overturn
And I think
Roe.
that one would likely be John Roberts. He is anything, he is conservative, so-called ideologically, but he's also conservative in terms of his own personal orientation, in terms of his style of judgeship or justiceship, to make a word. He's not one to want to break long-standing precedents.
Staunch Catholic, though, right?
Staunch Catholic. Well, you've got, this is interesting. Most people don't even realize it. There's all Catholics and Jews on the Supreme Court. There's not a single Protestant on the Supreme Court.
I can't say I disapprove of that mix.
Yes, I know you do.
No.
But
it is interesting. Those are rule-based. Those are rule-based religions, right? It actually, I think that's part of why they come out of that tradition. A lot of lawyers, Jews and Catholics, it's you start early. How can I get around these rules to do what I want?
But at the heart of the pro-life movement, I think, has to be a basic statement of foundation, which I don't think the pro-life movement has effectively articulated. And that is that in this argument, you have to stipulate that you're looking at 2 very powerful rights that are clashing here. The right of the woman to control her own body, and the right of that child, or whatever you want to call it, in the womb to have life. You have to stipulate that you can't just dismiss a woman's right to choose what to do with her own body. You can't just dismiss it and say, well, that doesn't have much constitutional authority and power.
And also, and this I think is another reason why we can talk about this issue, and it's sad that so many others, you can't say to a pro-life person that you just want to control women's bodies. That, I think, we can really dispense with that argument. It's absolutely ridiculous and disingenuous. We know that what pro-life people there may be one crazy person somewhere that wants to control a woman's body, but we're talking about, as you say, the child. Fetus to me is a better term, just because it seems more scientifically
more
accurate.
clinical.
Yeah,
more clinical.
So the fetus. Is that fetus a human being or not, and what rights, if any, does it have? That, to me, I think, is the principal question involved here.
Absolutely.
I like the trespasser kind of analogy, which is to say, if you come home and there's a trespasser in your house, you're allowed to throw them out, right? You're legally, but you're not allowed to throw them off a balcony. You got to throw them out the front door. Okay, you can't kill them as you're doing it. And if a woman has a fetus inside her and she wants that out of her, seems to me like she has the right to have that removed. And if so, it's about viability. And if that fetus is viable to be able to live outside of its mother, then I think the law should protect its rights to be evicted gently. In other words, this is an anti-partial birth abortion statement.
But the end result is still the same. It's the termination of a viable fetus. And I'm clear with my own statement. I'm talking about viability outside of the mother. Okay, so it wouldn't be viable in that instance, and it's not viable. Well, one of the reasons that such a significant percentage, and I don't have an exact number, but a significant percentage, highly significant percentage of the pro-life movement is among the Christian community and people of faith, because they think beyond the mere science of it to the genesis of the child and the fact that all life emanates from God, and therefore all life is innocent. And that even covers the cases, the really thorny cases of rape and incest, which are still rare. You know, it's still used as kind of a talking
let's
point.
Let's put a pin in rape and incest and address that in a minute. I want to ask you. I want to interrupt with a question for you, which is the most mainstream, sort of practical, if you want to call it that, or whatever the right term is. What is your vision for how abortion should be treated legally in the United States? At what point? What happens? Do people get arrested? Is it 10 seconds after conception? Where do we draw these lines?
Well, the faith-based side of me would say abortion should be absolutely illegal. The constitutional side of me, which lives in a constitutional republic, believes that the 10th Amendment holds that states should be able to determine by themselves that if Alabama wants abortion to be strictly illegal, they must be allowed to do that. If Vermont decides they want all abortions to be legal, even up to the point of birth or even beyond in some cases, then I can't really find a constitutional basis to prohibit that. So the constitutional argument is different than the faith-based argument, but I cannot sit here and say that we would, in this constitutional republic, have a legitimate way to deny a state the ability to decide for themselves. And then it becomes a matter, Scott, you know, like so many other things, like if you like marijuana, you might want to live in Colorado. If you don't, you might prefer to live in Mississippi where it's still illegal.
And on the borders of these states, we might see abortion clinics lined up to service the people traveling out of state. Would you think that it is appropriate or okay for instance, Alabama to pass a law that criminally penalizes women who wish to travel from Alabama to seek abortions?
Women should not be penalized because, you know, in our view, and I think it's backed up by so many stories over the years, that the price that women pay for abortion comes in just the fact that they do it and the fact that they've taken a viable fetus and they've terminated it. And I don't believe the stories that say that has no impact on women. It's just like birth control.
I think the data. I think there's good data on this, and it indicates that it is. I mean, whether or not it's ultimately a quote unquote good decision for those women or not, it's not something that, you know. I remember years and years ago, during the sort of abortion debates and wars of the 90s, the term unviable tissue mass was put out there as if this was, you know, like a fatty tumor that somebody had removed. And I think the data clearly indicates that it's not the equivalent of a fatty tumor.
And Scott, the thing is that the reason I respect your position is because it's a thoughtful position, but the position of so many on the left is to dehumanize the fetus to a point where it is just a tissue mass and it becomes just another in a series of decisions you check off your list. And like I say, the woman's right to control her own body is a powerful right, but it comes in conflict with the right of that child to live, and you have to choose between them. Is basically what any person deciding what their position is on abortion. They have to take that. They have to confront that question, and not the Constitution, but the predicate to it, the Declaration of Independence says the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay, let
me finish, please. Because liberty and the pursuit of happiness are irrelevant if you cannot have life to begin with. And that's the constitutional argument that I would make.
So what about this, then? You say it should be left to the states. A state can't start killing people for parking in a red zone, right?
Right.
That would be a violation of the the Bill of Rights as applied to the states, okay, under our current constitutional system, in order for a state government to kill somebody, they have to jump through a lot of hoops, right? Capital punishment, or to allow killing. I think that there's a weakness there in your 10th Amendment sort of analysis, this federalism analysis. Let's make it a tough choice. Let's say it's a third trimester situation. Okay, so we're not dealing with cellular mass. We're dealing with a fetus with a heartbeat and a brain and feelings. I mean, and there's no debate here about if the Supreme Court says that is a human being, just like you're a human being and I am, with the full suite of rights that come with being a human being.
Well, then that changes the whole equation. Yeah, okay. I mean, it does. But as I see the law now,
would you argue for that change?
I don't know. I'd have to think that through. I mean, I'm not certain about that, but I basically decided, both as a Christian and as a constitutionalist, that the proper position is to be opposed to abortion in all instances, to try to change hearts and minds if possible, and to have a constitutional framework for making abortion what it should be at best for pro-choice people, which is that there would be enclaves where they could get abortions and there would be enclaves where they could not. I think that's the most solid. I mean, look, there's a basic thing that there's only one thing that every person on this earth has in common. That's the fact that they were once a fetus. They were once a fetus. So the idea that it's a tissue mass or something less than a human is not, it's not really a viable argument in my mind, because that is a human life. I mean, look, it's logical. It's a human life. And we're seeing the science is identifying that more and more. Nothing's changed. It's just that we can see the formation of human life better than we ever could.
I think technology
before.
actually, and I think I predicted this, not that I was, nobody wrote it down or anything, but I remember some years ago thinking technology is going to dial back the time with which when an abortion is appropriate, because as we learn more and more, I think these heartbeat bills are indicative of this. This is, we know more about what's going on in there, and that's
and we can see more, and I think that's the most important part, is that we can now see it. Nothing's really changed.
Well, no, our understanding,
but our understanding and ability to see.
Yeah, I think that just so my position is stated clearly, I think that at some point between fertilization and birth, a human being is present, and it's not at fertilization, and I don't know where exactly it is, but that's the line for me that I think needs to be drawn, and then laws applied for restrictions in that area. Where that is, I think science will tell us. But in terms of the rape and incest question, I think that's a very fascinating debate. So there was a huge challenge within the Republican caucus in Alabama that passed this measure, whether to include exceptions for rape and incest. And I'll just state my position. It's pretty clear. It's either legal to do this thing or not. And the status of how, I mean, unless you say that, I think the only argument that makes sense to allow an exception for rape and incest is to say one of the reasons why abortion is illegal is because a woman undertakes sex and voluntarily is pregnant and needs to bear the consequences of that when there's this other interest involved, this fetus. And if it was non-consensual, then, well, we're going to make an exception because she doesn't bear the burden of installing that fetus, essentially, right?
It's the hardest argument to make, that if you believe that all life is God-breathed, then the child of a rape victim is as innocent as that of that's conceived within marriage. It's a very, very hard argument to make, but ultimately you come down on the right side. I mean, this thing is either legal or it isn't. It's a very difficult case to make, especially for men, to say if you've been raped, or a victim of incest, that you must have that child.
Carry for 9 months, growing in your body.
I don't really know how you make that argument, because it appears to be cruel. it becomes an esoteric argument for a woman who's the victim of a rape. But it is also, let's point out, that is a bit of a canard because it's such the exception. The rape and incest is such an exception to the rule that it's used as trying to make pro-life people look more extreme because they would ban it in the case of rape and incest, even they'd say in the case of rape or incest.
It is a tough thing to say. I think you're right to say that,
It is. I mean, that's where you have to change hearts and minds. I mean, you have to be able to make the very hard case that though the child was not conceived in love, that you could still love the child, or you could bear the child and put it up for adoption.
Tim, let me say that. I mean, that's a good hearts and minds argument. We don't need that for the legality. It's just, hey, you just can't terminate. That's all. We don't have to like it. You just can't do it.
Well, I think a big part of the reason rape and incest was included in this Alabama bill, Scott, is because it was designed specifically for the Supreme Court in an absolutist legislation and law that's now going to be replicated in other states. And as you said, the last time we talked, I forget if it was on radio, the podcast, you said that there's going to be so many states that are undertaking these kind of laws that the Supreme Court's going to be forced to
address it,
to say yay or nay.
Almost certainly, ultimately. I think this will percolate up to the court. Yeah. The other thing I think of when I see these rape and incest exceptions, just sort of how I read, my reading of the news with respect to liberty-impacted stories, Tim, I foresee a lot of false rape allegations whereby Susie got pregnant from her high school sweetheart, wants to have an abortion, and now has to say that she was raped in order to get it. Just like the false health of the mother type things that, some of these, I don't know if the restrictions for the health of the mother in this Alabama bill are quite strict, including I think a physician has to personally examine and sign off on it. It's not one of these, well, they said, some nurse signed a form at the Planned Parenthood clinic. It's like you actually had time with a physician, and for the mental state, I think it's a clinical psychologist has to meet with the woman and sign off that, the abortion is warranted in that regard.
So that they avoid the inevitable emotional fallout from having aborted a child. And you can't say that there isn't one. There has to be. There always has been. That's not determinative of law.
I was going to say, yeah. Well, you can't.
I mean, it's not.
Let's not sound like we're protecting them from themselves. We're either protecting innocent human life in the form of that fetus or baby, or not. I think is the appropriate way.
I can't disagree with that. Yeah. I think that's a good formulation. And by the way, I think this has been one of the most productive conversations that I've heard, if I do say so myself, on this issue from people who disagree about it.